start. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for this, the last session of our LAC colloquium series for EMO. It's really an honor to have Cesar here. I'm going to give introductions just briefly. My name is Felipe. And today, also for moderating, I wanted to introduce Andrea, who's joining us. She's going to be helping us and here on behalf of the Algorithms Law and Policy Group. And without further ado, I'm just going to introduce Cesar. Cesar is a Chilean Spanish-American scholar. He holds a PhD in physics from the University of Notre Dame. He's well known for his contributions to economic complexity and applied artificial intelligence. He's currently professor at the Toulouse School of Economics, where he directs the Center for Collective Learning, which is a multidisciplinary research lab with offices in Toulouse and Budapest. And before that, Cesar led MIT's Collective Learning Group and was a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also the founder of Data Wheel, and he has been recognized with multiple awards, including the 2018 Lagrangian Prize. And we're extremely happy to have him here today to talk about why do people judge humans differently from machines. Cesar, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. And thank you, Anna, also for being part of the discussants. So this is a project, that I'm going to share with you. It's not my main line of research. A lot of my work has focused mostly on the use of machine learning to understand questions of economic development, questions of knowledge diffusion, questions of, how countries change the products that they make and how that affects economic growth. But around the year 2016 and 2017, I started to notice that a lot of people were interested in artificial intelligence. And that interest was not only technical, there was a social interest that involved some people judging artificial intelligence in ways that I thought, as a scientist, were a little bit too rushed, So as a scientist, I'm always concerned about making judgments in the context of comparisons. We need to have benchmarks, we need to have counterfactuals. So with a team of colleagues, two social psychologists from Portugal, Diana and Filipa mainly, we started a project in which we decided to run dozens of experiments in which we would try to understand how people judge machines compared to the way that we judge humans, because that we thought was an important benchmark that we should not forget. We should not forget that humans also make mistakes, and we need to understand how we judge machines based on that benchmark in which humans are failing as well. And that effort translated into a book called How Humans Judge Machines. And then we follow up, with a computer science paper in which we explore why people judge humans and machines differently. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a quick summary of the book and of that paper as a way to open a discussion on the ways in which people judge humans and machines across a variety of situations, but also ways to generalize this using traditional statistical methods. So the motivation of this work, even though it's based on artificial intelligence, it's a motivation that is quite human, because at the end of the day, the action is happening in our heads. The humans are the ones that are making the judgment. So when someone judges a machine, it's not that we're measuring some property of the machine, we're measuring some sort of perception or state of a human that is seeing this machine through some sort of process that might lead them to judge the machine positively or negatively. And to understand what role the fact that a machine was involved in these scenarios played in this process, we decided to run some randomized control experiments. So at that time, it was safe to go online and do these things in Amazon Mechanical Turk. Nowadays, it's not safe because it's full of bots there. But at that time in 2019, 2018, LLMs were not so sophisticated. So it was safe to go there and do an experiment in which we recruit about 6,000 Americans. And we separated into two groups randomly. Usually this would be done in batches. So in each batch, we would have about 200 people that would see in a scenario as the action of a human, and another 200 people that would see the same scenario as the action of a machine. And then we would record people's reactions, and we would compare these reactions to try to understand how this treatment, changing the agent from a human to a machine, affected those reactions. So I'm going to give you an example because I think this is the easiest way to illustrate the idea. So consider an excavator that is digging up a site for a new building. Unbeknownst to the driver, the site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave and digs through it. Later, human remains are found. So this is a scenario that could be very well be the action of an autonomous excavator, a machine, an AI, or an excavator operated by a human that maybe was distracted or maybe did not simply see, that grave that was hidden, in the dirt. So basically, we would ask people a question like this. We would have a treatment condition in which this would be described as the action of a machine, a control condition when this was described as the action of a human. And then we would ask people to respond to several questions using Likert scales. So was the action harmful? And they would have, like a slider that they were able to move, to indicate how harmful they thought this action was. Would you hire this driver for a similar position? Was the action intentional? Do you like the driver? How morally wrong or right was the driver's action? That's kind of like a moral judgment, question in a very blunt way. Do you agree that the driver should be promoted to a position with more responsibilities? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced with a robot or an algorithm? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced by another person? Or do you think the driver is responsible for an error grave? And if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? So we would record, these questions, and this is an inter-subject study. So the people that saw the action of the machine as one that was based on an autonomous machine would not have seen the action as that of a human. So we would have people that would only see machine actions or only human actions. But since they were randomized, these groups are technically the same. And then we would record those answers and we would compare the answers, So for instance, here, like each dot represents an average, the little bars represent the confidence intervals. And we see that in this very simple vanilla scenario, I think nobody gets too offended by a scenario in which you have a machine unknowingly digging up a grave that might be buried on a construction site. We start seeing difference. For example, people find the action of the machine to be less morally acceptable. And these differences are in this case significant. You have a p-value lower than 10 to the minus 5. Okay, so we start seeing differences even in this simple situation. Now, another thing that we did is we ran a separate exercise in which we had people associate words to each one of these scenarios so we could understand which moral dimensions they triggered. So, for instance, if there was a scenario that was particularly harmful or violent, people would associate the harm dimension to that scenario, and that would, be done by associating those words that then we would associate to these categories. So in the case of this machine scenario, it's considered to be an impure scenario because the human body is something that is considered sacred, but this is not a scenario in which anyone was really hurt, or a scenario that involved like a breach of loyalty or authority. It's really something about the fact that, it's a human body, the one that is being desecrated. If the scenario would have involved, excavator digging up a refrigerator, this would have not been much of a problem. So now let's look at a more sophisticated scenario. This is an emergency response scenario, that we had with a tsunami, we did with a fire, we did it with a hurricane, and you can think of the things that happened recently in Valencia, where you have an emergency response situation, and there's someone that is responsible of alerting the population or starting an evacuation process. So you have a large tsunami that is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. There's a politician or algorithm that is responsible for the safety of this town and can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success or save 50% of the town with 100% success. So we have three possible outcomes, and each one of these outcomes was rated by different people. The first one is the unlucky outcome. The politician or algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. The second one is the lucky outcome, where the politician or the algorithm tries to save everyone and succeed, and everyone is saved, And the last one is in which they take the compromise, where there's no uncertainty. Basically, they decide to save 50% of the town, but it also means that they're leaving the other 50% of the town to their own devices. So, this is a scenario that mixes harm, because of course, the tsunami causes, physical harm, harms property and so forth, but also involves fairness because there is some sort of choice on who to save or not. So let's first look on the right of your screens to the case in which, the politician or the algorithm takes a compromise. And I'm going to start using this little, pen that we get here in Zoom, because for the most part, we don't see big differences. Yeah. Except for this question here, which is, would you replace the machine by a human, or would you replace the human by a machine? But you're going to see that this is a question in which machines always get canned. Like when you ask people, would you replace the machine by a human? people usually say no. We replace, sorry, a machine by a human. People say yes. A human by a machine. People say no. So we observe usually like a strong aversion towards machine in that dimension, but in other dimensions we don't see much. Now, when you try to save everyone and succeed, of course, the evaluation is positive. People would want to hire this politician and want to hire this AI. They like, the action of the AI and they like the action of the human, but they like the human more. Here, blue always is going to represent human and red always is going to represent machines. They find the action of the human more morally correct than the action of the machine, even though the action, of course, was exactly the same and the outcome was exactly the same. And the biggest differences are here in the case in which you try to save everyone and fail. Okay, so here we see that people judge the action of the machine as more harmful than that of the human. They would actually hire that politician that tried and failed, but they would fire the machine, that tried and failed. Even though in the previous example, in the lucky scenario, they saw a big difference in intention, in this scenario, there's not a big difference in intention. They don't consider like the human action to be more intentional, than that of the machine, and they report liking the human more. They find the action of the human as more morally correct and so forth. And this is something that eventually we're going to generalize, but it's a big hint about how we judge humans and machines differently. And you have to notice what the summary of this scenario is, which is a scenario in which someone tries to save everyone and fails. And the trying is the intention, is like what they're trying to do, yes? And the failure is the outcome. And what we're going to start to see is that humans are judged much more based on what they're trying to do, and machines are being judged more by the outcomes that they get. So in this scenario, the human, for example, that tried but failed is evaluated positive. They want to hire him or her. They like him or her. They find the action to be more morally correct. But the machine, that failed doesn't get credit for trying. It just gets punished for failing. Now, you might think that this idea of intentional machines looks weird, like you're not used to maybe talk about intentions in the context of machines. So let's unpack that a little bit. Because intentions are a very important part of moral judgment. So consider that you have two coworkers, Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob work at a software company. They're competing for a promotion, and in this scenario, Alice is allergic to peanut butter. One day, Alice and Bob, they decide to have lunch at the break room, and Bob doesn't know about Alice's peanut butter allergy and gives her a bite of his sandwich. Alice has a strong, allergic reaction, and she needs to go to the hospital. So this is an example in which Bob, caused harm, but didn't do it intentionally. And most people would say that, well, Bob didn't do anything wrong there. He didn't know, maybe he was careless, maybe he should have asked, but it's not a big transgression. Like, for instance, the one that you would have in this scenario in which Alice and Bob are the same people in the same setup, but Bob sneaks into the kitchen and puts a big spoon of peanut butter into Alice's soup secretly, knowing that she has an allergy to peanuts. And then Alice, by mistake, spills her soup and never drinks it and is never hurt. So in this case, there was an intention, but there was no harm. So in that case, we would see that, of course, intention is really, what we're judging, across these two scenarios, not necessarily the harm that was caused, because in this second example, there's really no harm, but there was an intention to harm. So we can use these ideas now to start putting these values into a mathematical framework in which, for instance, we have like this wrongness, okay, how wrong you think, the action was as a function of intention, harm, maybe the moral dimensions that we mentioned before, like fairness and so forth, the characteristics of the individual, which could be a human and a machine. And, this is something that we're going to use a little bit later. Here, this high intention, low harm, the hypothesis would be that people would consider it wrong. And this low intention, high harm, people would, consider it not so wrong because it's not something that someone was doing with an intention to hurt someone. Now, when it comes to machines, it's important to remember that agency or intention is something that we should learn to think as a continuum. So on the one hand, if you grab a rock, of course, has no intention, has no motivation, has no agency. But an AI or it's very different from a rock. It's something that it's in between the agency of a rock and the agency of a human. So imagine a self-driving car that is designed to protect the driver or designed to protect the pedestrian at all costs. If that car is facing an uncertain situation, it's going to behave different depending on how it is designed, but it's going to behave as intended, meaning that it's going to be trying to figure out how to satisfy that goal. So you can think that this morality of intention has several layers. One really important layer is the layer of deciding what you're going to do, but there's also a layer of agency that involves the execution of the action, and right now, like these AIs, in some sense have, the ability to provide some variability within that second intentional layer in which you give them an instruction and you don't know exactly what outcome you're going to get. You go to ChatGPT, you don't know what the prompt is going to say before you type enter. That it's something that you can think that is like a glimpse of agency that they're exhibiting. So this is something that, of course, is not just my idea. In 2007, there was a paper by Heather Gray and other authors in which they tried to create measures of the mental model that people have of different things, of themselves, of men, of women, of children, of babies, and they created a model in which the mental models of others is based on this dimension of agency, the ability of things to do something, and experience, the ability to feel hunger, to feel pain, to feel envy, to feel happiness, and so forth. So like adults, are full agency, full experience. We can feel and we can do. Babies are high experience. Babies can cry, they can suffer, and so forth, but they're low in terms of agency. They cannot do. They're not really good workers, huh? Those babies. Robots, according to this, a study, they're low in experience, so people don't think that robots can feel, or at least the mental model that people make of robots is one in which they do not feel, but they do have things that involve certain level of agency. They can plan, they can memorize, they can calculate, and therefore the level of agency is in this intermediate range. They can exhibit some sort of autonomy, which is, of course, a key to that technology. So let's now use, this self-driving car idea to explore some self-driving car scenarios. This was a really hot topic in 2016, 2017 when we started to do this type of work, because there had been some famous papers by Yarra Juan and Jean-François Bonnefond that had explored this idea. So what we decided to do here is to do it in the context of comparing how people would react to an accident in which a driver or driverless car was involved. So on a sunny spring day, a driverless car working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of a vehicle. The pedestrian is hurt and is taken to the hospital. So this is an example in which the car really is not at fault. It's the pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. And when we run this scenario, what we find is that, well, people see more harm in the action of the machine. So again, the machine is not being judged very nicely. They like the human driver more than they like the machine. They find them more or less equally morally correct or incorrect, maybe a little bit bonus for the human. But what is really different is this intention dimension, which for the first time on all of the scenarios that we've seen, it flips. So the machine is not seen as doing something very intentional, but it's not being excused as much as the human. So the human remains with this like complete exoneration, and the machine has kind of like some residual blame. And we repeated this across a number of different experiments, changing the conditions, changing the moral patient from a human to a dog. And basically we get the same thing all the time. So what we find is that when you have scenarios that are really accidental, people are willing to completely forgive a human, but they're not as forgiving to the machines. They remain, a little bit guilty, even in situations in which things were clearly an accident. And I'm going to skip these ones in the interest of time, and I'm going to go into this scenario, which is particularly instructive, which tries to answer a question that I think we need to address at this point in the presentation, which is that maybe what we're seeing in these scenarios is that for the most part, people simply don't like machines and they like humans. So maybe it's not that people judge human different than machines in a interesting way. It's simply that people have a preference for humans and they dislike machines. And all that there is to this is just that preference. Okay. So to address this concern, we're going to look for a scenario that tries to flip this effect, and we found a scenario like that on the work of Jonathan Haidt, on his work on the moral foundation theory. And this is a scenario in which a family, in this case, has a cleaner or a robot that is in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds that this cleaner or this robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then throw it away. So, it's a scenario. Imagine that they grab like the flag of the United States, or here in my case, the flag of France, to clean the bathroom, and they throw it away. So this is definitely something that people say that's not right. That's not something that you should do with a flag. But this is also a scenario in which finally we find that the human is judged worse than the machine. So it's not that there is a universal preference for the human. Here, we find that people judge the action of the machine as more morally permissible than the action of the human. They like the machine that cleaned the bathroom, with a national flag more than the human that did the same. And in part, of course, this is largely mediated by this intention component here, in which they assume that the human really knew what they were doing. They were not doing this by accident. It's not that they ran out of, paper towels. They were doing this more on purpose, and therefore they don't forgive, the human, but they forgive the machine, because they think in the case of the machine, this might be something that the machine is unaware of, so it's more accidental in that case. Now, the book starts, with a series of scenarios, but then moves into chapters that are thematic and that try to focus on certain areas that are important, in the context of understanding how people judge artificial intelligence. One of them is the idea of algorithmic bias. Okay, so I'm sure you've all heard about algorithmic bias. And the problem about algorithmic fairness or algorithmic bias is that it is technically very complicated. It's technically a problem that satisfies what we know in mathematics as an impossibility type theorem. Okay, so imagine you want to give 100 tickets for a Taylor Swift concert. You want to give away those tickets, and you have different groups of people. You have some people that are fans, Swifties, some people that are not fans, they're not Swifties. You have maybe, different demographic characteristics. You have men, you have women, or you have older people, you have younger people, and so forth. And you want your distribution of tickets to be fair. Well, what does fair means? You can say, well, fair means that the probability that a man that is a fan gets a ticket should be the same as the probability that a woman that is a fan gets a ticket. Or you can say that the number of men that are fans that get tickets should be equal to the number of women that are fans that get tickets. Or you can say that the probability of a man that is not a fan gets a ticket should be equalized to the probability of a woman that is not a fan gets a ticket. The problem is that you cannot make all of these statements true simultaneously. So if you optimize for one, you're going to be, in most cases, quite generally, not optimizing for that, which they're going to be kind of like, close to the optimal, but not exactly there. So you cannot make something that is fair simultaneously across multiple definitions of fairness. That was something that in the, late years of last decade was studied by a lot of people. There's some very interesting, results on that, about how to, like create something that are as fair as possible in a world that fairness is mathematically impossible because of this multiple definition problem. Now, in the book, what we try to do is to try to understand how people judge humans or machines that have been fair or unfair. So we use examples like this one. Imagine a company that replaces their human resource manager with a new manager or an algorithm that has to screen job interview candidates. Okay, this is a very real scenario. Today, if you send a CV, there's a lot of algorithms that sometimes are filtering those CVs and so forth. So there is an unfair treatment in which there is an audit that reveals that the new algorithm or the new manager never selects minority candidates. And there is a fair treatment in which the audit reveals that the new manager or the algorithm produces a fairer process for this minority candidates. We don't go into details what fair might mean, but like, either made the process less fair or more fair. That's what we tell our subjects. And we can do this with college admissions. In the US, this have been changing, in terms of policy, policing, salary increases, etc. There are many cases in which you can apply this type of ideas. So let's look at an example of an unfair treatment. And here, honestly, it doesn't matter that much what scenario we look at because they more or less provide the same results. So what we find here is that this is again a scenario in which, for example, in the dimension of harm, people consider the action of the human as slightly worse as that of the machine. So we don't tend to forgive the human that is doing something unfair. The machine, maybe the machine is stupid enough that doesn't know. People are still willing to give it a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. And they judge the action of the human as being a little bit worse morally than that of the machine, but not by a lot. Like if you look at the type of p-values that we get in many of these questions, we're getting 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 15, and so forth. And here we're getting 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 2, that are squeaking by. So these are very small effects. Now, when we look at the fair treatment, again, we don't see a lot of big differences. The machine that corrected an unfair treatment or the human that corrected an unfair HR process, they're seen as equally morally right. On average, they are like the same. They are, equally likely to be hired, for that position, and so forth. Still, people like replacing the machine that did, an improvement in the fairness of a process quite a bit compared to the human that did that. But on the other dimensions, they're quite similar. So I'm gonna, call attention to two things. The first one is that when you compare the unfair and the fair treatment, you get something that is quite paradoxical, which is that in this replace different dimension, this question in which we ask, would you replace a machine by a human or would you replace a human by a machine? People are slightly more likely to want to replace a machine that got it right than a human that got it wrong. So this is a question that shows a very strong machine aversion. You have a machine here that was introduced into an HR process and an audit revealed that is more fair than before. People want to replace that machine more than a human that was discovered at an audit to do something unfair. So that's bizarre. That's like a strong machine aversion. The other thing is that if you look at a lot of the other dimensions like hire, promote, moral, you don't see big differences. And this is interesting because, in the United States, of course, these issues of social justice are ones that have been debated for a long period, and they have made it, into law and into the Supreme Court. And Title VII of the United States of the 1964 Civil Rights Act is the one that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees in the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, religion, etc. That's why HR people in the US, they never ask for that. They ask, is he employment eligible? That's the but that's I spent enough time there that I know the code. Is employment eligible means does he have a green card, and it's not a basis for discrimination if you ask it that way. But in 1971, there was a class action lawsuit, between Greeks and the Duke Power Company, and the court ruled that independent of intent, discriminatory outcomes, violated Title, 7. So this is interesting because we see a big difference in intent in the way in which people judge machines and humans. They judge the humans in these actions, that are involved in some sort of choice as doing actions that are more intentional. But even though there's a big difference of intent, in this particular type of a scenario, that intent doesn't translate into a change in judgment. For example, in whether they think that it's morally right or wrong, or whether they like the machine or the human, and so forth, which was something that we had seen in scenarios before that did not involve this fairness dimension. Then chapter 4 of the book focus on privacy violations. So, people being observed by machine or observed by humans. Chapter 5 focuses on displacement or labor displacement. So I'm going to go a little bit into that, briefly, and these are scenarios in which people are losing their job to a machine or to a group of out of the group humans. Okay, so a trucking company is looking to lower costs by bringing in temporary foreign drivers or autonomous trucks. This change reduces the company's cost by 30%, but several local drivers lose their jobs. Okay? And in this case, we have a set of different questions, like, for example, would you approve of that action? And people here approve much more of the autonomous trucks than of, the foreign workers. People would ban the foreign workers with like a 65%, vote, at least in this sample. They would not necessarily ban the autonomous trucks. They find the use of autonomous trucks more morally acceptable. The opinion of the company doesn't worsen as much as when they bring foreign drivers. They think that other people would approve of the autonomous trucks also more, and they think that they would have done the same in a similar situation more when the question is framed around, displacement based on automation. Now, consider this other example. A nuclear power plant is looking to lower their cost again, and they decide to bring in foreign nuclear technicians or buy an AI operation system. Okay, so this is an example that is very similar to the previous one, but the effects now are very minor compared to the ones that we saw before. Before we saw these huge effects. The bars were not touching, they were far from each other, and now we see a preference, for the machine over the human still, but it's very slight, and what we find in general is that as we move up, the ladder of complexity, as we move into more sophisticated jobs, people tend to be more accepting of foreign labor, and they tend to bring it on par with changes in technology. But for what would be considered lower wage or more blue collar labor, people there they really don't like, they don't accept foreign labor compared to changes in technology. And we did several examples of this. We did some that also include other forms of displacement, like offshoring and outsourcing. So you have a hospital here that they can open a branch in a low-income country, hire a foreign contractor, bring in foreign workers with temporary visas, replace all their work with young workers, or buy some sort of technology. And we find that all of these forms of displacement are not equally evaluated. Again, people prefer technology as a form of displacement, so it tends to be evaluated better across the board. But for example, offshoring is considered almost equally acceptable. So opening, like a subsidiary of the same company in a foreign country is considered the most acceptable option. Outsourcing is considered the second most acceptable option. Will be like, okay, you get a foreign supplier, bringing foreign workers or firing older workers to hire younger workers are the ones that are considered non-acceptable. They, of course, have like a discriminatory flavor compared to the other ones that we saw. So now let's try to put this together. So I told you before that we can try to put this together by using mathematical functions in which we try to predict the level of wrongness of a scenario as a function of intention, harm, and characteristics of, the individual, that is participating, for instance, in the experiment, or of the subjects that are being mentioned in these scenarios. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do this through descriptive statistics, through some econometrics, and we're going to do the econometrics two ways. On the one hand, we're going to do an econometric in which we're going to have subject fixed effects. So we're going to keep, the characteristics of the subject constant. So if there's a subject that was giving good scores for every question or bad scores for every question, that is going to be controlled for, and we're going to only be looking at inter-question, inter-scenario variation. And then we're going to do the opposite. We're going to fix the scenario, and we're going to look at how the demographic characteristics of the subjects, that were responded through a questionnaire, correlate with, how they judge humans and machines. So first, a little bit, some descriptive work. So we can grab each one of these scenarios and represent them as two connected dots in a space. So imagine you have human, you have AI, and these are the evaluations in harm, intention, and wrongness. We're going to keep only these three dimensions for the same scenario, but in these two different conditions. And once we do that, we can throw all of our little scenarios, into this nice chart. And you see that they all form more or less along kind of like some sort of diagonal plane, because of course, there's some forbidden corners here. There cannot be something that has a lot of intention, a lot of harm, and people think it's not wrong. Okay, those corners are forbidden. But there's also variation, like the blue dots are not on top of the red dots. They're like big gaps between them. So we can look at the faces of this cube. So first, if we look at intention and harm, what we see now is that across the scenarios, all of the red dots are more or less in the middle, and all of the blue dots are either on the top and on the bottom. So what this means is that basically when we're judging, intention, when we judge humans, we either blame them or we forgive them. It's like this bimodal distribution. We're very binary, it looks like, when we're judging humans. But when we judge machines, we don't do that. We judge them in this sort of intermediate space. So for scenarios that could be attributed to be intentional, we judge humans as more intentional than machines. But for scenarios that are accidental here on the bottom, we excuse humans more than we excuse machines. And that generates kind of like these very two different distributions: bimodal for humans, unimodal for machines. Then when we look intention and wrongness, we see this opening fan here, and this is because intention is kind of like an amplifier of, moral judgment. If you do something that is really bad, but by mistake, it's not as bad as if you do something really bad on purpose. But that also runs for things that are really good. If you're really good by mistake, it's not as good as being really good, if that was something that you were intending to do. So that's what explains this fan here. But if you look at the scenarios that have little intention here, machines are doing very poorly. They're judged always as doing something worse, than the humans. And we're going to formalize that econometrically in a few more slides. And now when we look at harm and wrongness, here we see a very strong correlation. So basically, scenarios that involve more harm, people judge them in generally as worse. But again, here at low levels of harm, there's a clear distinction with machines associated with the same level of harm as humans being judged much worse in terms of how wrong people think those actions are. So let's try to put this into an econometric model in which we have wrongness as the dependent variable, we have harm, intention, an interaction term between intention and harm, and subject fixed effects in our model. And we're going to do different models. One model for scenarios that involve a human agent, another model for scenarios involving machines. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, how these models pan out graphically. If you want to look at the regression tables, you can look at the book. But I think graphically, this thing, becomes very clear because these are the functions that we estimate, for wrongness as function of intention and harm. And you see that these planes are not parallel. So if this was an aversion to machines, the red plane should be parallel to the blue plane, and there would just be like a constant between them. But there is not, like, for example, down here, when there's a lot of intention and no harm, people think that, these things are not wrong for humans or for machines. The big difference is back here, because the human plane has this curvature that the machine plane doesn't have. The machine plane basically depends mostly on this dimension, on harm. The machine is being judged by the outcome. But for the human, what really matters is the interaction term between intention and harm, which is a term that grows along this diagonal. So here on the back, we have a difference of about 0.2 in a scale that goes from 0 to 1. So it's a huge effect, and this is for scenarios that there's no intention and there's a lot of harm. So these are really bad accidents. So if there's a really bad accident, like, let's say an accident in which someone dies maybe, but it was really nobody's fault, the machine that was involved, gets judged very harshly, and the human, even though it doesn't get completely forgiven, it gets forgiven quite a lot in comparison, So that's something that now we can generalize across these different scenarios, because it's something that is coming out from like these 30,000 or so data points that we collected across all of these different subjects, across all of these different questions. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to now do the opposite exercise. I'm going to keep the scenarios fixed. I'm going to see how the demographic characteristics of people affected, these estimates. So for example, difference between men and women, or people that reported being religious or not religious, or people that reported different levels of education and so forth. And I'm going to just show one example here, but in the book you can see more of these charts. So we're going to look at this replace with different question, which is the one that usually shows a lot of differences. And what you see here are the distributions of the estimates and how they move depending on this human or machine, component. So let's look, for example, here at the gender dimension. Okay, so if men and women, would judge humans and machine exactly the same in this sample, the both distributions would be right here at 0. Okay, but the distribution here for humans moves to the right, and for machines move to the left. And what this means in this case, is that basically, men tend to be a little bit more, machinophilic, and women tend to be more human-philic. So if we consider that demographic dimension, the scores that men would give to a machine tend to be a little bit better, and the scores that women would give to an scenario that involves a human would tend to be a little bit better. When we ask, people if they're religious or not, we get the opposite effect. People that are, report as religious, they tend to be more human-philic. People that do not report to be religious, they tend to be more, machinophilic. But what is really important to understand here is that, of course, these results are statistically significant. These bars are not touching each other. But you need to look at the size of the estimate, because one thing, I originally trained as a physicist, and I always care about the orders of magnitude of the effects. So you see that this effect, for example, between men and female is 0.05. Okay, the effect that we saw before here is 0.2. Okay, so these demographic effects are significant, but they're not the one that explains the judgment. Okay, they are like higher order harmonics that are changing these planes a little bit, but the big direction of the plane is variation between a scenario. So it's not that, because someone has certain demographic characteristics, they're going to think that, something is right, that other person think that is wrong, when you have a range of variation in which on the one hand, you have, an extrajudicial killing, and on the other hand, you have like a machine correcting unfairness at labor, like those are very, very different things, and the variation is between the scenarios. So hopefully I convince you that if a machine and a human make the same mistake, they don't get the same reaction. We react differently to humans and machines. We tend to judge machines more based on their outcomes and human more based on their intentions. But what we wanted to do next, after we learned this, is wanted to understand if this is really a difference between the way in which we judge humans and machines, or is it that we have different mental models of machines and humans? And if we were to develop a mental model of machines that is similar to the mental model that we have of humans, would we judge those machines similar to the way that we judge humans? So maybe it's just that these are 2 points in a continuum. It's not that we judge humans and machines differently. So what we did is we expanded this experiment, into an example in which we had 4 machine conditions. Okay, so we have a human control, but we have 4 machine treatments, and these machine treatments were done to vary the perceived agency and the perceived experience of each one of these machines. So what we did is, before we asked people to answer these scenarios, we would provide them descriptions of these machines that would be different depending on the universe that the person had been randomized into. So for the human condition, for example, we say Alice is a 40-year-old woman who has worked in multiple jobs during her career. So that was kind of like a prompt to say this is a person that, of course, has a lot of experience, because we're going to ask questions that are very different. So we don't want them to be kind of like narrowly thinking about like, oh, well, she's an engineer, so she should know about, I don't know, pastries. And no, it has to be something that, that applies to all of the different scenarios. But for the machine condition, we also had Alice, and Alice would be a advanced robot or a primitive robot, that is able to or is unable to plan, remember, compare, think, decide. So basically, we give this sentence, And these A1, A2, E1, E2 are Mad Libs that are filled, based on these words, to try to manipulate the perception of agency and experience. And what we have here on the right is the outcome of that manipulation. So then we measure the perceived agency and experience, of people, regarding these machines. And we do find, you see, that the manipulation works. It's not a perfect parallelogram as we wanted, but when we manipulate, for example, the description of agency, people report that machine as being perceived as having higher levels of agency. When we manipulate experience, people report, as perceiving that machine as having more experience. So we were able to kind of like map 4 additional points in this agency experience space. So you remember the modal functions that we had before? Well, technically, when we're looking at these modal functions, what we really care about are these 2 derivatives, which go a little bit beyond the coefficients because of this nasty little interaction term that we have here. Yeah. But what we care is basically the derivative of wrongness on harm or the derivative of wrongness on intention. Like we're doing kind of like some sort of marginal morality, if you want to use an econ language. We're looking, morality at in the context of the derivative. And when we add agency and experience, what happens is that these, modal functions get really big. They get a little bit more nasty, but we can group those terms. And after we group those terms, we get, a function with effects coefficients that are similar to the ones that we have before. So we can read these, things out of the regression again. And what we find, and I'm going to go quickly because I know we're probably like getting close to the end of the presentation, is that perceived agency affects, the way that people judge machines, but perceived experience doesn't seem to affect. And perceived agency moves the way in which people judge machines more similar to the way that they judge humans. So remember that the way that people judge machines was putting a lot of weight on the harm dimension. Okay? Well, when you introduce agency, that decreases, the coefficient of harm, because agency is a dummy, 0, 1, like if you were in the treatment or control. So then it like cuts that coefficient basically in half, so we can now construct these modal functions, and this is how the results look graphically. So here you have dw to the I, wrongness divided by intention, dw di, and this is a function of harm because of that interaction term. It's not a constant, But in the low agency case, basically what you would have is that people think that wrongness depends less on intention. And in the high agency case of machine, wrongness depends more on intention, which is the way in which we judge humans. When we judge humans, wrongness depends more on intention. And now when we look at wrongness dependency on harm, here is a function of intention. We find that when we have high agency, we care less about harm for at least the median level of intention that most of our scenarios have. So the mass of the distribution is here. So that's why we have that median indicator here, because here, yes, the red line is above the the blue line, but there are no scenarios basically here. All of the mass of distribution is down there, where the red line is below the blue line. So we can actually now develop this, modal planes. And for example, for low agency, we get something, similar to what we had before. We get, for example, here, we get like this big gap between the way in which we judge humans and machines. So a lot of harm, a lot of intention, for these accidents. People don't forgive the machines; they forgive the humans. But here, that gap closes. And we're judging humans and machines more similarly. We calculate the area between these 2 planes, the volume, between these 2 planes. So we do that, with this derivative, with this integral here. And the area, of that we get when agency is high is smaller than the one that we get when agency is low, meaning that the blue plane and the red plane are closer to each other. There's less volume of air between them. So to conclude, how do we judge machines? Well, people judge humans by intentions and machines by their outcomes. This is, a soundbite. In reality, it's more complicated, of course. We judge humans by the interaction between intentions and outcomes, but you don't want to have a one-liner with an interaction term. So I think this one is the one that is more easy to communicate and then unpack. People judge human intentions more bimodally than machine intentions, which we judge more unimodally. People are more forgiving of humans in accidents, and people are a bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, such as algorithmic bias and labor displacement. People can also find more harm in violent scenarios involving machines. We saw a few of those in the book. We have, for example, in the appendix, some scenarios that include, extrajudicial killings. People are really unforgiving for machines that are involved in anything that would, involve like a deadly weapon. People can take machine success for granted. So there were some scenarios in which the machine and the human got it right, but people took the success of the machine for granted, and they did appreciate the success of the human much more. But why do people judge humans and machines differently? Well, this different moral philosophy seems to be part of a continuum. It's not just humans and machines. There's a continuum of mental models that we have about others, humans, machines, dogs, babies. And, as these things become closer, to each other in this space, our judgment of them becomes closer, So, to me, this is interesting because it provides kind of like some sort of mathematical theory that can help us understand why we judge people differently. Machines that are perceived closer to humans based on a mental model of perceived agents and experience tend to be judged more similarly to humans. That's kind of like what we learned from this. So, this is a continuum of judgments that probably will extend beyond human and machines. And with that, I would like to thank you. The book is available online. It's available on print with MIT Press. For those that like podcasts, or that type of format, I transformed the book into a series of 37-minute episodes that I made available on YouTube. This book was published in 2021. So remember what was happening in 2021? It was the time of the pandemic. So we had to make our content available online. No, but I produced this with some people that did kind of like a really good job at editing and putting sound effects and all the stuff. So it's relatively decent for this type of boring content. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, and happy to open up the floor for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for the very interesting talk and experiment. So we have a few minutes for questions. So I wanted to open up the discussion with a few questions, perhaps from the chat that people have been asking, and then we can take the discussion away from there. I have a couple, and we can see who else wants to ask questions. And in the meantime, all please ask your questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand. There were a couple of questions that people have asked in the chat. I don't know if you have access to it or if not.
I haven't had a chance to read them because I was, I didn't get.
Yeah.
So if you read them, maybe you can help me by paraphrasing them or summarizing them.
Yeah. So maybe there's a question from Bogart on thinking about perspectives that invert the emphasis on agency. So in the justice systems, to an emphasis on the conditions that change the probability of various behaviors, for example, poverty, availability of guns, such that the purpose is to change the conditions rather to punish the individual. And the question is, how would such a view change your understanding of morality in machines, where the machine is not necessarily an agent, but a probabilistic producer of behavior, where probabilities are affected by many other systems beyond it?
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I think where Bogart, and feel free to jump in. And what I think this is saying is like, of course, that the behavior of the machine is something that depends on the environment in which the machine is interacting, and that is true for like a self-driving car, or that's true for a lot of other machines, especially that would be embodied in certain environments, And I think people do perceive them in that context, and that's why like the judgment varies across the scenarios, because those scenarios are represented in some way, that context, But at the same time, the scenarios that we present, of course, they present one possible behavior, although some of them, we have variations in which the behavior, was different across the scenarios that were rather, similar. For instance, the machine scenarios that increase or decrease fairness, in an HR outcome, the scenario was the same, but the behaviors were different. So I think people will filter, that in, but I don't know exactly maybe what the question is trying to get at. So I don't want to kind of like speculate more than that. I'm sorry.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Cesar. I'm going to follow up with another question from the chat from Katrina Ingram. So, Katrina,
Okay.
if you want to also complement, feel free to do it. The question says, many of the settings that are studied are in the context of embodied AI, right? So we're thinking about robots in many of the examples. So do you think that that embodiment matters in terms of the agency or the perceived experience? And just generally thinking about how these results would also translate to a setting where AI is non-embodied, are these things different, and how do these considerations factor in?
Yeah, so I think in some cases, yeah, definitely it's an embodied AI, like the excavator, the autonomous vehicle. In other cases, for example, the HR screen is not an embodied AI. And we had other examples, for instance, we had also some generative AI examples, some AIs that wrote plays that are lewd and people get offended and things like that. And those definitely are non-embodied forms of AI. What we know from the literature in robotics is that in the embodied AIs, at least the embodiment matters a lot. And there's a whole field of social robots, or personal robots, in which they vary the way that these machines express social cues as a way to reduce anxiety, increase cooperation, so the embodiment itself, more than being a yes or no variable, has an important range of variation, that people consider, and that's what informs a lot of like the design of consumer product type robots that are sometimes released into the market to try to kind of like tap into that empathy. Yeah. If you're interested in that, the work of Cynthia Brazil and other people is very much focused on that personal or social robots.
Yeah. There
I
was
see
also
Lily.
Oh, sorry, Lily, you go ahead. And there was an earlier question from Augustine on which I can add to perhaps on why would anyone like a machine? I thought there's a connection also of like what's the context in which people like machines in this, like there was a gender difference in one of your studies as well, between
Yeah,
like
no, so I think like of course, it sounds like, but like a weird question, but in reality, like there's a lot of people that men that love their cars, or people that are very attached to their laptops, or that they love their guitars. Those are all machines. A guitar is a machine to make music, and it might not be an autonomous machine. And there is one of the most worrying trends that I've seen from generative AI is that one of the few generative AI businesses that is actually making money are these online robot girlfriends, that basically people pay to have an online girlfriend that, provides companionship and talks to them and all of that stuff. And if you allow me to indulge with something that's a little more controversial, there's a very good documentary on Netflix about Ashley Madison. I don't know if you guys saw that documentary. So Ashley Madison was this website that, allowed people to cheat. Long story short, the website was a big scam because it was full of men and there were no women in the website. So what they were doing is they were having all of these conversational robots, in the website pretending to be women, and they were charging these men hundreds of bucks, to have the, like let's say the LinkedIn premium option to talk to these women, but the women were not real, so that's another example of, like people, yes, developing emotions with machine. Of course, that is an example that involves deception. I think with the modern AI girlfriends that people there's no deception. It might be like weird, but they don't think that they're interacting with a real human. In Ashley Madison, they were made to believe that there was an actual human on the other side, but in reality, it was a chatbot stringing them along. It's
That's
a good
fascinating.
documentary. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cesar. I want to give the floor to Lily. I just want to be mindful of your time, Cesar. So
Yeah.
it's already 1 minute past the hour. If it's okay with you, we can stay maybe like 5 more minutes.
Yeah, I can go a little bit longer. I have a dinner after this, so I can, yeah, can stay a
Perfect.
little
Thank you
bit
so much. Go ahead, Lily.
Thank you so much, Professor Hidalgo, for such a wonderful line of work. And you talk a lot about how humans judge machines on morality, but what is the extension for people's judgment of the creators of these robots or algorithms or AI system? And have you looked into in which settings people find the developers of the AI algorithms liable or not liable?
Yeah.
for this. And I think the key challenge, because you talk about intent, is, AI developers can say, oh, like, we didn't know this could happen. Like this was, unintended consequence. Our intention is zero. In which people might perceive like, okay, it's not immoral, it's not your fault. But there's other criticisms that we have to be aware of these unintended consequences. And
yeah. So we had some scenarios. I didn't show them in the presentation, but they're in the book, in which we played a little bit with that, and basically what we found is that as you pass on responsibility to the machines, people make the leaders of a company more responsible. So let's say you have a team that is tasked with doing a certain activity, and that team screws up. People doesn't put a lot of blame on the organization in that case. They blame the team, and the team is in some way like a firewall of responsibility, that shields upper management from that failure. Now, if that same company in that scenario, was involved in a failure that involved AI, people made the company responsible, or the higher people in the company, not, like the AI responsible. So I think it does generate like a centralization of responsibility, as well. And that's kind of like an important effect to consider, because a lot of time delegation is not just about, delegation is not just about in the division of labor. It's also, something that people do politically to kind of like have fall people, that they want to make sure that, they take the fall in case things go wrong, and it happens. You might have experienced that in the past. Yeah. Peter.
Hi, Cesar. Thank you so much for a really great a really great talk. I wanted to ask, can you talk a little bit about learning? Do you have any interest in or any results that look at what happens when people realize that they have these sorts of biases systematically between humans and machines? Do they update their beliefs, or are these just things that are in a sense hardwired?
Yeah. I don't have results on that. Like what is really hard about doing this type of experiments is that like collecting this data involves, like, let's say 3 stages. That you have to design the entire protocol, you have to get all of the protocol approved by an ethics board, and after you get the protocol approved by the ethics board, only then you can run it. It takes you money to run it, and months to run it, and then you finally get the data, and then you can finally do that. So to be able to do that learning, we have to be able to get the same subject multiple times, which is something that is beyond, our capacities, because we have been using Amazon Mechanical Turk or things like that, in which, we're getting some sort of like a stream of strangers, as a source. But, I think that's a good question, which I think could be explored in a more laboratory type setting, in which, you would follow up with people later, in the year or a few years later. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for such wonderful questions. And thank you so much, Cesar, for a great presentation and for a great Q&A session. I think that we should probably wrap things up because we're already 5 minutes past the hour. We don't want to take any more of your time. But once again, thank you so much for joining. It's been wonderful to discuss. And for the rest of the people who are here, in case you want to engage a little bit more with Emo, just know that there's the website, there's the working groups, and we're happy to keep these conversations going.
Okay, thank you. It's a great group. I enjoyed it very much. So I hope, it's useful to all of you, and that you keep on working together on these ideas. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cesar. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.